Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi. Once again, I have this opportunity to sit with you this evening and listen to the story of someone who was drawn by the Holy Spirit to recognize a deeper walk with Jesus Christ, which included a discovery of the fullness of the church. And for our particular guest tonight, it was a coming home. Sean Chapman, for want of a better term, we use the word Revert because he's come back to the church. He's got a Man in the Woods blog. We'll hear more about that. But Sean, welcome to The Journey Home.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you here.
Great to be here.
And I didn't know if we wanted to admit this online, but you're a good mutual friend of Father Dwight Longnecker, right?
I am.
You're involved with his parish and some of the folk that live down there in that neck of the woods.
It's a great area and good people there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to have you on A Journey Home. Let's hear a little bit, start way back at the beginning and give us a glimpse of your spiritual journey.
All right, well, let's see. So in essence, I think it's probably the best place to start is, I don't remember a time where I didn't believe in God.
Okay.
In a sense, the idea, the great name of God has always sort of been present to me for whatever reason. Obviously, it's a gift of faith. So I never struggled in that area very much.
You think you credit that to your parents or to the
I do.
to the church where you were brought up as a young person?
I credit more to my parents, and
Yeah.
we'll get into that in a second because
Right.
I really didn't have very much of a taste for organized religion. So
Okay.
as many of my generation probably can relate. But yeah, I would say my parents. We always said grace at meals. In fact, I remember it was back in the time where you could say grace in school. God is good, God is great, let us thank Him for our food on men. You would say it as quickly as possible and get to the food, you know. It was just, but no, my parents, we would say grace at meals. We would say prayers before bed, you know, blessing everything in creation, including every pet we've ever had, you know. And we would go to church, and that was basically it. I would say, with respect, it was kind of like we were theist with a veneer of the Christian faith. I mean,
Yeah.
It was there, but it wasn't, you know, Christ was not somebody we invoked as a sort of personal relationship. We went to church because that's the way you do,
Yeah.
and if you're going to be religious people in the United States of America. And so...
Were your parents kind of drifting in where they were going to land too? Is that what kind of set that stage for you?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. And I would say I would describe us more of a kind of a church hopping family, and it was kind of that agitation of where do we belong. And I think they were going through that themselves. They had 60s, 70s, and 80s, the sort of identity which is not deeply rooted in a profound kind of ecclesiology of where it permeates your life. In fact, my parents, it's pretty amazing that they were religious at all, because their parents kind of really weren't. They sent them off to church, interestingly, but they never went themselves, their parents. So, but I think my mom in particular was driving that. She wanted us to have a good foundation, you know, rooted in the commandments, but didn't really know how to provide it beyond you know, prayer and, you know, grace and those things. So I would say that that's what we did. My dad was Episcopalian, my mom was Catholic. I did receive First Communion, I was baptized with First Communion, First Confession. I remember distant memories of that. But there was no, in my kind of imagination, it was not more deeply rooted than that. It was.
Okay.
So we would go to non-denominational church. It was called the Village Chapel, I remember. And we'd go to my dad's church, which was Emmanuel Episcopal, and we would go to the Catholic church, and it would depend.
Yeah.
If you asked me, I would probably told you, I said I prefer the Episcopal church because the cushions are more soft and the sermons aren't as boring. That would be probably it. But I would say that even during that time, I had a very keen sense of God is real and God is personal. I remember in 5th grade, we had the contest to draw God, and I came in 2nd place. Well, it's pretty funny too, because I was not a good artist at all. And I remember actually sitting there going, what am I going to do? I'm going to draw this like old man on a throne. I'm like, first of all, somebody can draw this better than me. I'm not a good artist. And also it's kind of too typical and lame. I mean, so I said, what am I going to do? So I wound up shading in, sort of shading in the the picture in like a kind of a bluish hue, and putting at the top, I don't know what God looks like, but I do know that I love him and he loves me. And it worked, apparently. I mean, I wasn't trying to be,
Now, was this in a public school?
No, it wasn't a private school, but I would say a private school that had really no kind of religious bent or
It's
affiliation.
just interesting that the teacher would ask you to do that. Yeah.
Well, it was actually, that the teacher, but also the county. It was a county project.
Really?
So
Interesting.
So it shows you, even today, it's hard to imagine anybody even suggesting that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean that idea was there, but I think, in particular, I think there are two stories that sort of explain and more clearly give you an idea of why I felt the way I did about religion and about organized religion in particular, and what kind of shaped my view of Jesus, because that's really what is sort of the driving force behind sort of moving far away from God, this sort of prodigal son idea, and then moving back. So there was this, basically one day my parents were took me to the village chapel, the non-denominational church, and I don't think there were many things that they didn't have to fight me on. Anything new. I mean, I was kind of, unfortunately, that type of kid that it was like, okay, you're going to make me go. I don't want to go, And it was always like that with church. I mean, I was like, I would hide under my blanket, and hopefully they would protect me from them having to do that. And so they took me, and I was crying, yelling, I don't want to go. I hate this place. I don't want to go. I hate church, and I don't want to be a part of this. And I remember them taking me in there, and they're saying, fine, if you don't want to go in, fine, you just stay out here. We're going into church. So I remember I said, fine, great. Anything is better. Staring at a blank wall is better than. So I'm standing out there. I'm sort of looking around. There's this sort of gathering hall, or it was like a place for youth group or something. And there's nothing in this room. The lights were out, and just looking around. Except I saw there was this big, gigantic chalkboard. And this is probably the first and last time I was particularly interested in math. But I just heard, somebody had just introduced to me the word infinity. And I was fascinated by the word infinity. And I thought, I know exactly what I want to do. I want to count to infinity while they're in there. So, I mean, obviously I'm young enough where I don't really have a sense of, I don't know, maybe I was 8 or something.
Although you do have a sense that the service is probably long.
Yeah. So I said, it would have seemed more like eternity, right, being in there, right? So I start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm like, I think I can do this. I think I can get there. It's my own personal Tower of Babel here. And I climb up to the heavens. And so I'm counting the whole hour, and I'm about 996, 997, and in my mind I'm thinking, I'm going to get there. I'm probably 6, 7, 8 numbers at best away. So, keep going. And it's like, I guess I thought in my mind, like, I'll know it when I get there. So it was like 1003, 1004. And my parents came out. I guess I'd made it that far. And they're like, it's time to go. And I remember just sighing, being kind of sort of frustrated and angry at them that they had interrupted me because I was so close. I figured, who knows, maybe it's a little farther than I thought. And in retrospect, it's a perfect symbol for who I was and where I was, because it was I clearly had a hunger and a taste for the divine, but I wanted to get there myself. I wanted to climb to heaven on my own, and I certainly didn't want to have to submit to something that I didn't understand or relate to. And obviously, you can point to the problem of catechesis and understanding what is liturgy for and what does it mean, and but that's kind of where I was with.
And always just a little bit more, and I'll get there myself.
Yeah, and a lot of my, leading up to my conversion was that kind of thing. Like, if I can just, maybe I can do this alone. Maybe I can have God be what I want him to. I mean, that's not how I was thinking in my mind. But there was what also developed at the time was a very kind of anti-Christian element to it. A kind of, I don't know, because of what I saw in the culture, some of the stereotypes, I began to, and I was in, I don't know, I was only even 10 at the time, where I just saw it as a kind of a hokey thing, where these kind of what I imagined as sort of hokey evangelical preachers or something, where there doesn't seem to be a sincerity there. That doesn't mean there weren't, but I didn't particularly see them. I'd watch them on TV and stuff. One in particular that I met that really kind of shaped that for a long time was my parents wanted me to go to camp. It's another one of these trying to make me do what, something that is good for me, but I don't really want to do it. So it was going to go to camp for a few weeks with my cousins and brothers and sisters. And so I'm being driven up there, and I said, I don't want to go, and I'm kicking and screaming and crying and just making it pretty hellish for my parents at the time. And they're like, what do we do, Now my mom will probably say at this point, I'm sorry, we shouldn't have done this. Well, basically they told me, well, when we get there, if you still don't want to go, you don't have to. Don't worry about it. So you see where this probably goes. So we're it's about an hour and a half drive. We make it there, and we get there, and I said, well, I still don't want to go. And they said, you're going. So, you can only imagine, right? I've been betrayed. What have you done to me? You've lied to me. And of course, like I said, my mom would say, well, I probably could have found a better way, and we shouldn't have lied to you. But at any rate, I'm still fighting. I'm fighting them tooth and nail. I don't want to, whatever you do, I don't want to go to this thing. So much so that they left me in the back seat and took everyone in to sort of register and sign up. And I thought maybe I won. Like, did I win? And I'm like lying in the back seat with these tears, kind of breathing. And did I win? Are they going to let me have my way? Well, a few minutes later, as I said, I'm lying in the back, so I'm looking through the rear view mirror. I see this guy in this yellow camp T-shirt coming. I'm like, uh-oh, they've sent somebody to come pry me out. And so, I remember seeing him knock on the window, and I'm looking at him kind of suspiciously, and he keeps doing it and smiling at me. And finally, you realize you're a kid, you got to open the door, So I open the door, and so he looks at me. He's like, oh, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." And I sort of felt like I've always described. Sometimes when I tell my students this, I tell it as I felt like a little squirrel, like at the back of a cage, like being sort of trying to be summoned and tricked out of the cage. And he tried to talk so calmly to me, and it felt very patronizing. I just sort of recoiled in the back, and he's like, and this is where he, sort of the fateful moment happened. I was just sitting there and sort of just like, I'm not going, you can't make me go. And he looked me in the eye and he said, it's okay, I love you, and so does Jesus. And I remember looking at him with just this disgusted looking, like, you don't love me, you don't even know me, get away from me. And it was just this very, very visceral reaction to it. And I don't know what it was. Of course, I eventually relented. I know, I couldn't do anything, and of course, I had fun at camp and all that good stuff. But that was what was stuck in my mind for the longest time. I think this is who Jesus is. Jesus is this bright and happy, overly happy camp counselor that's trying to tell me he loves me, and I don't really know who he is, and it's kind of weird, and it's kind of creepy, and I don't think I can relate to that. So that was kind of my early relationship. So I had, as I said, I had this kind of dual relationship. This God, I believed in God, but I also, this Jesus person just seemed very, very strange.
Our guest tonight is Sean Chapman. When you look back on I love hearing stories in the sense that God is often preparing us for how we can serve Him later. And that you're a young man kicking and screaming. C.S. Lewis kind of talked about that same battle that he had as he was being drawn. The last place he wanted to go was end up being a Christian, let alone an evangelical on fire Christian. And it seems like that was the preparation for your early stage, was fighting and kicking in every way you possibly could against God.
Absolutely. Yeah, like I said, probably the only doubt I ever had of God's existence was I had this kind of combative, but a loving relationship with my cousin. And I was like the youngest in the whole family. And I remember him saying to me one time, he said, "You know, do you ever hear about the Big Bang?" I'm like, "No, what is that?" And I was in 8th grade or something. And he goes, "You know, God might not exist. There's this Big Bang." And I just remember having this brief moment of doubt for a second. So like, that was probably the closest example of it. So yeah, so going into high school, I mean, I continued to go to church somewhat and tried to go as little as possible, but usually you made to. And I remember we were driving to church one day and thinking to myself, okay, I know I believe in God, but maybe I think I believe in heaven and hell, but what else? What else do I believe? So there really wasn't much progress one way or the other. I think my parents just finally let go after a while and said, okay, if you don't want to go to church, don't go to church. And I would sort of be at Christmas and Easter, definitely go, and depending on the occasion, would go to church, but not consistently. So I would say by the time I was 16 or so, I would have said that I was not Christian. I mean, or I was, I believed in some kind of vague idea of Jesus, but I was more of probably a theist than anything else. And
maybe God didn't even come to consciousness very often in terms of the equations of life.
No, I mean, I think, and this is where, once again, another kind of story of God was constantly, I think the most beautiful thing for me about the way God loves us is, it's not the Fatima miracles very often. It's not the resurrection where 400 people or however many people were eyewitnesses. It is these intimate moments where he says, I know you specifically. You can try to tell this story to some other people. They might get it a little bit, but I know you especially will get it. And so I did have my 11th grade year, I remember it, because at that point I was basically like, okay, I'm in trouble, God help me. That would be the only time I would pray to God. Maybe I would say a few prayers at night, but so there are two things in particular happened my junior year of high school that really began to shape the journey home, so to speak, but not in ways that you might suspect of a longer version of that. The first one was, I would say, this kind of an incredible event. One Saturday, I remember, it was the middle of my 11th grade year, I was traveling with a friend to do a favor for his dad. We were bringing rocks to his rock quarry. It was about an hour and a half away. I'm from Pinehurst, and we were going up to Raleigh, about an hour and a half away, if anybody knows that, knows Raleigh. But so we're about halfway there, and somehow we became aware that one of his tires was about to go. When I think back, I can't remember exactly how we became aware of this, but we were, and I remember going, oh God, please don't because this is before cell phones, and we were pretty far between gas stations, so we knew it was going to be a decent, perhaps potentially a decent hike. And so I was saying this prayer, and I'm a huge music lover. Ever since I've been a little boy, not just music, but lyrics. I memorize lyrics. It's a weird thing. It's like if there's a moment, something going on, a song will come to mind. So we're traveling. I'm praying to God, please don't let this tire go. And all of a sudden on the radio, this song comes on, and it was popular at the time. Name of it's called Tennessee by Arrested Development, hip hop group. Okay, I'm not a huge hip hop fan, but I liked the song at the time, and I remember, but I didn't understand any of the lyrics. It was a very sort of quickly spoken and sung, sort of almost spoken word song. And so as I said, I didn't understand the lyrics any times before. But all of a sudden, when the song came on, immediately I understood what they were saying. And the line was, and I won't sing it here because I don't want to scare anybody, but I know you're supposed to be my steering wheel, not just my spare tire. And it just stopped and just sort of became clear. Like, oh.
Yeah, great line.
I know you're supposed to be my steering wheel, not just my... Could it be any more specific than that, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that I'd never understood what it was saying before, and pretty soon after that, the tire went, tire blew. We were able to put like a kind of tiny replacement tire and get to a gas station, or get to our destination and work things out. But I never, it just hit me. It's like, this is what God is trying to say to me. It's like, you know what? I mean, I don't need to tell anybody. I mean, it's pretty clear. You know, you can't just turn to me when, as your spare tire. I'm your steering wheel. I'm the center of your life, and we need to be more intimate here. I need to be more intimately a part of your decisions. Well, that was the kind of the positive side.
It's a great line, and I'm wondering.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like you had much catechesis to fill in the gaps for what that meant up to that point.
No, and I was going to say a little bit later, but fair enough to point out now. I don't think I even knew really what the word conscience meant. I don't. So when I felt certain things inside, I just went with, okay, I feel this way. But conscience is something obviously much more powerful, which is, you may feel this way, but you need to, or you may not want to do this, but you need to act this way. Yeah. So in that, as I said, that comes into play a little bit later. But that same year, I had this. It was in some ways an awakening and a getting further away from God. It's strange to say that sometimes some events in your life work in two different directions. But I was taking this teacher really was influential for good and for ill, I think. He taught philosophy. And it was just, I was like, okay, now, finally, this hunger, this thirst for something more than just what I viewed, rightly or wrongly, at least in the way it was presented, as a kind of rote memorization. That Jesus was really about the smiley camp counselor. God bless him wherever he is today. I hate, but he, it was so important in this story. But that's all that it was. It was memorization, and that it didn't have any greater depth than that. What does it mean to say that Jesus died for you? I mean, it doesn't mean anything to me. And I'm just saying that.
Right.
So my thinking, when people say this, almost as if it's self-explanatory in a what some call post-Christian culture, it just doesn't resonate like it might have. So that's where I was. So this philosophy teacher, he sort of introduced me to some of the great philosophers, including Augustine, Aquinas, but also, some may have never heard of, like Plotinus and Leibniz and Kant or Kant, however it's said. So he really seemed to be the sort of my gateway to going a little bit deeper. However, he also had a kind of a chip on his shoulder about the Christian faith. And I could tell, and you could obviously say he's sort of patronizing about it. It was what I gathered, and what I the sort of understanding that I developed was it's religion for spiritual children. Well, there's an irony to that too, of course. That's true in a good sense too. But I thought of it in a way it's like, if you need that stuff, like my parents saying to me around that time, well, what about the 10 Commandments? And me saying something, well, that's a good starting point. Well, yeah, but are you keeping the 10 Commandments? It's easy to dismiss them, but are you keeping them? So this teacher who introduced me to all of these figures also introduced me to a kind of, well, that's fine and everything for people that need that. Augustine, I remember him getting how annoyed he seemed to be over the fact that Augustine seemed to be obsessed, in his opinion, with the pairs in this, the great autobiography, the Confessions. And he just said, what is his obsession with sin? It's just sin. And of course, in retrospect, as somebody who teaches that now, I can tell that story and explain that it's not his obsession with sin so much as his obsession with trying to figure out concupiscence and why men act in ways that, like in the case of the pairs, that they don't really need to act. I mean, I didn't want the pairs. Why am I, as St. Paul says, why I do what I don't want to do. Yeah. So, but at the time it was, okay, yeah, this whole sin thing, this is the enemy. And my teacher would say, well, there's no right or wrong, there's no sin, there's soul making, right? There's right thinking and there's wrong thinking. And I still, I still read some of his stuff, and it's still that way even after all this time.
Yeah. Yep.
And so that was the beginning of where, on the one hand, yes, I'm going, God, I want to know you. I want to find out who you are. But at the same time, kind of saying, well, but God is a God that doesn't judge, and sin is just a word that religious people came up with to try to control people. You know, the usual things that you hear. These hypocrites, these people that want to use fear instead of growing in the Spirit, soul making, enlightenment, right? And this is where the sort of Eastern religion comes into the picture of the goal of life is not salvation in the sense of holiness. The goal of life is enlightenment, Gnosticism, or knowing, thinking you have the truth within you, not how you.
Your experience just points out how if a person doesn't believe in the reality of evil, the influence of evil, a person can be then susceptible to the whispers of evil. And then when you get a little alternative whisper in your head about reality, that then colors everything. The way you read Augustine, the way you read Aquinas, the way you read the church, and you can discount everything and one step after another until it really doesn't mean much. And that's what's kind of happened in that philosophy.
It's the worst kind of narcissism, spiritual narcissism, which it's kind of like the adolescent child. And I did this to my parents as well as my spiritual parents. I took what I wanted and then took off. Once again, back to the prodigal son again. I mean, it's a perfect image for the modern world, which is to borrow all the insights and the wisdom and the gifts that are given to you by your fathers, spiritual fathers, even your physical, biological parents, and then claim it for yourself and squander it. And that's basically where I was. And so realizing that basically if there's no sense of a deeper purpose or a fight in this life, it actually starts to make you depressed.
Well, sure. It
brings you down, and it, even without realizing it, a lot of this stuff, disintegration of the kind of the spiritual life, having something more rooted, but looking at life as, well, there's no right or wrong, there's just finding a truth, actually winds up, some people would think, well, it's going to make you happy, you're just doing what you want to do, you're finding your own truth. And in the meantime, I found myself getting more and more depressed. I was having some family problems at the time, of sort of feeling like things are falling apart, and so I'm looking for these solutions, not in Christ, not in a Savior, but in enlightenment and things that will bring me peace.
And it makes me wonder if down deep you're also struggling with the reality. You said from the earliest days you could remember, you assumed that there was a God up there, even that slight time of doubt that you had, but no, there was a God. But when you compound that with this, there is no right or wrong, it starts undercutting everything, then it undercuts, well, what kind of a God is there, if there is a God? Even if that idea came up in your mind at the time, what kind of a God is this? Is he a good God? If there's no good or bad, is he a good God?
When you start getting into, and Eastern religions, for example, you begin to discover darker things.
Yeah.
That's not, I think the difficulty is we grow up with Christ and we assume we do an overlay of the sort of Christian ideas on Eastern religious philosophy, and we make it happier than it is. Yeah. But there is this sort of lurking darkness in the view of creation being not good, not creation at all. It's just this illusion, and it can only bring you sorrow. And
a lot of the Eastern religions saw creation as a battle from the very beginning, a battle, in that context, that fine line between the good and the evil, the yin and the yang, the battle there. Why don't we pause there,
sure.
Sean? We'll come back in a little bit. We're leaving Sean at a pretty low place, and we'll come back after the break and see how the Lord brings him out of that. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi. Our guest tonight is Sean Chapman. And just once again, Man in the Woods blog is the name of, or they can search it and find your actual blog.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we paused at a low point in your life.
Yes, well, certainly this experience of kind of serious depression, a sense of disintegration in family life, in spiritual life, in way I was living, sort of following the typical thing, the wrong instincts, the wrong crowd in an attempt to be accepted, but also having this kind of element of the spiritual desire. Unfortunately, as I said, was searching at ways that were not bringing me closer to Christ, let's put it that way. So my senior year, we had what sometimes called in school a mini-mester, where you take a little break from the rather regular school things, and teachers teach something a little bit different. And the teacher that was teaching me philosophy decided to teach transcendental meditation. So of course, being where I was at the time and being interested in Eastern sort of religions, kind of getting into little New Age stuff, reading that type of literature, took it. So he taught us, during this mini-mester, how to do this, how to breathe, the breathing exercises, and also how to use certain mantras, which is where now,
was he into this, or he was just as a professor?
He was, and he is to this day.
All right.
And so he's teaching the students this, and I guess he had permission to do this. Teaching the transcendental meditation. So the idea of emptying yourself.
Yeah.
Now, they can seem kind of appealing, especially if you're not feeling at peace. And so the idea of at peace, this mantra, and it just sort of go into nowhere land. But we know in science and in the Christian religion, a vacuum tends to be filled by things. And so as I began to do this, it on one hand, it brought me a kind of peace where I was sort of feeling detached, but it was kind of, I don't care about anything detached. Yeah. And on the other hand, I started to have sort of certain darker experiences. Like if I had used a mantra, if I couldn't sleep, I used it to go to sleep, I would have nightmares and things and sort of terrible dreams. And so it's interesting, this sort of time in my life, as I began to get ready to go to college and look, as I, spiritually I'm looking into these sorts of things. I also began to have these, and this kind of sounds a little weird, but these mystical dreams. Some were good, some were evil, some seemed like warnings, apocalyptic warnings. Just to give you an idea, I dreamt quite a bit about the ocean, and I kept warning people, telling them they got to watch out, the ocean's coming closer and closer. Now I don't think it was a global warming dream. It may have been, I don't know, but what would happen is I'd pray and I'd be taken up to the high cliff wall, as even as the ocean got closer and closer. I mean, of course, I didn't know anything about Psalms at that point. So I mean, I can't remember which Psalm specifically it is, but it reminds me to this day of that. Also, a dream about, and this is, I think, in particular, related to my view in transcendental meditation and kind of New Age and self-deification. I dreamt that I was in this field, and I start running in the field, and I see this, speaking of cliffs, I start running towards it like I'm going to run up the side of the cliff. And so I run up the side and I push off and I start falling backwards. Like I thought I was going to fly, but I didn't. And I start falling towards the ground. I pray to God to catch me, and so I fall. He does, and I kept falling on the ground. I look up at the sky, and all of a sudden there are all these colors coming from the sky, and then there's blood coming from the sky. And then it turns completely gold, and then everything just shuts down, and there's this cross in the sky, and I wake up, So these kind of things, and I don't know what to think about them at the time.
Well, they're vivid enough that you remember it all these years, for one.
Yeah.
But at the time, were you seeing the connection to this transcendental emptying of yourself, almost inviting within that void this?
Well, I think I saw this as all part of this spiritual journey and growing.
Yeah.
But I guess I would say it wasn't bringing me any more peace. I was getting all these kind of mystical I started all these kind of having these mystical experiences, and it wasn't resolving the kind of the need for peace. I was in fact, I remember having this conversation with my aunt, who was also into kind of the New Age thing too, and we would talk a lot about this, and we were totally, we'd talk about really, Jesus is a nice teacher, that's good, but he's just one of many teachers. And I remember saying at one point, I was reading this thing that said that we are God, and I said this to her. She says, "You are God," and I remember how much that just disoriented me. It creeped me out, and this is really where it was going. This is where my belief system was going. Is this kind of idea of I am, and never. The irony is, you think you're God, you're pretty happy about it. It was as depressing and as low as anything could be. And I remember, to tell you how obstinate I was. I went to this basically this counselor who was kind of a New Age counselor, and I was telling him about these dreams. I was like, I'm dreaming of good things, but I'm also dreaming about these really dark things. I'm dreaming of even I didn't mention this before, but even where I'm hearing satanic voices and things. And he said, well, there is no devil. Right? The devil doesn't exist. And so I'm trying to force myself to believe all these things that the New Age, the sort of Eastern view of that, there's not good or evil, there's just enlightenment, it's just getting above it. That's just your fear speaking. And I was even so far as I was praying with trees and stuff. He's like crystals and all this other stuff. He's like, our lives are meant to be experimental. We're supposed to experiment and spiritually experiment. And just test things out and experience things. So on the one hand, I'm feeling this dread within myself, and at the same time, this advice to to just ignore it. I was into psychics and all these. It's ironic that I want deeper thinking, and so I'm looking to all these kind of pseudo, this not really intellectual at all, purely just curiosity. So Ouija, sometimes I even did that, Ouija board, psychics, as I said. Also, I guess I would say of the things that began to really convince me of the reality of evil, even though I didn't want to believe it, and I was experimenting in dangerous ways. I remember even my parents were kind of getting into this sort of stuff. They had this kind of New Age counselor at their house. And I remember I was in the other room, I was meditating to it. I was just sort of listening to what she had to say. And I know this sounds kind of bizarre and weird, but some of these things just kind of happen in these odd ways. So I'm meditating and listening, and this New Age counselor, I want you to get in touch with, your dead relatives, and sort of I want you to imagine and picture them as a child and pray something. So I'm breathing, I'm praying, doing this sort of thing. And all of a sudden, in this room, I heard this noise that it sounded somewhere between human and animal. I've never heard it, and people heard it. It was the strangest thing. I'm like, what is happening? Well, we had tarot cards read in that room. I was like, what was it that, and I remembered that we had a reading done in that room, and I'm like, this is getting really weird. And just to make it even a little creepier, we had this little toy mirror in there, and if you picked it up, and you looked at it, it would laugh, and because it had a little button compressor, it was like a little. I remember walking into that room a couple days later, and it was just sitting there, and it just started laughing. I got religion pretty quickly. I got a priest up in there about as quick as I possibly could. So this is when I started going, okay, this is making me miserable. I'm not getting anywhere, and there does seem to be something evil out there. I don't care what they tell me about my fear. There's something going on here. Yeah. I think I would attribute two things to saving me from just continuing down that road that some people do for their whole life. I don't know how they do it. It was exhausting. Yeah. The first thing was my conviction from the start that God was personal, that he was real, that he was somebody that I couldn't just turn into myself. And I didn't want to turn him into me. There was a Seinfeld episode that once said, why would I want this? The guy Jerry Seinfeld was dating a woman that was a lot like him. He said, I stopped dating her. Why would I want to date someone that's like me? I don't even like me, you know? And so it was kind of like that at the time. I wanted God to be something other than myself. So,
Yeah.
and this was difficult for some of the people I was hanging out to understand, because they were like, why do you have to call him God? Why do you have to look at him so personally? So I had that conviction. The other thing was, and in my journey home, back to God would not have been possible without this wonderful family, and a best friend that I have who were Catholic and believed in things like black and white. It doesn't mean that everything is black and white, but there's objective truth. And so I'm in this world of where everything is true and nothing is true, or it's all just a big fog. And here I have this family that has this beautiful, they have this connectivity and warmth and communion, and it's just like you go and it's messy but beautiful, and it's
Now, how'd you make that connection?
Well, I went to high school with this guy, and he hadn't really been religious in high school, but I think just listening to me brought him back to more, and he would argue with me. Yeah, he would argue with me, and he would say, I remember him asking me one time, he goes, tell me, why do you believe what you believe? And I went on this spiel for about 10 minutes. And when I was done, I thought, man, that was great. What I said sounded pretty good. He goes, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. I mean, he was like I don't know if you know Flannery O'Connor, but he was my Flannery, the scourge of God. He would just slap me in my face when I need, and we all need that. And so here's this guy who wasn't anything like that camp counselor, who was reasonable, who would argue with me and made sense. And I had nothing to say. He would say, well, what's your problem with the church? And specifically the church, but the Christian faith in general. I was like, well, yeah, there's the Pope, and there's, I just didn't know it. I was literally had a bigotry for no reason, just based on things that I wanted to accept. So I had nothing to say in response. So he kept challenging me, and I think that as time went on, I couldn't resist that. And what I couldn't resist also was the fact that I was happier with this family that had such a warmth and everything that I felt like I didn't have, which was a grounding in something. My family is wonderful, but there's just something about the kind of the way in which a Catholic family, their faith permeates meals, everything that they do. So I would just kind of show up, and I wanted to feel that way. So that happened, and it was, he could probably tell you his own story in relation to that. So this is basically where I started to even visit like Catholic churches, and I would go with him.
The family. Okay. All right.
Yeah. Well, with him.
Yeah.
There's one event in particular where we were at this big festival. It's called Bell Share. It's in Asheville, North Carolina. It was about 20,000 people, and we were standing around, and we felt like together we just didn't belong. Like that there was just stuff going, like nobody, I don't know, it's a weird feeling, but you sort of feel like God's like staying there with you, watching this and saying, you need, this isn't where you belong. And so my friend said to me, why don't we go pray up at St. Lawrence's, which was the Catholic church in the city? And so I'm like, okay, I guess, so we go up there, and I remember being in there and feeling the presence, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what the Eucharist was. I didn't know that you could feel differently in the presence of the Eucharist. And it was just, the only way I can describe it is like the radiating love of Christ, just beaming, coming from his heart. And so we're in this church, and we're praying, and I still don't know a lot, but, and we're sitting there, and my friend says to me, and everyone kind of cleared out. He says, I want to talk to this guy in the back. There's a guy sitting there in the back of the church. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my friend is, as I think St. Catherine of Siena would describe, has holy recklessness. He'll just go, I'm like, do you really have to go? So he goes back to this guy and just starts talking to him and says, well, you need a ride? I'm like, why are you asking this guy? Well, he got separated from his family or something at the festival, and he was just sitting back there praying. Well, we eventually, he says, no, I'm fine, and we eventually leave. And we're 10 minutes away from home. It was about a 20-minute drive. And he goes, we need to go back. I'm like, why? He says, we need to pick that guy up. It was just the weirdest thing in the world. This is one of those moments where people get a weird courage to do whatever, and you're like wondering, okay, this must be from God. Okay, I'm going to trust it. So we go back. I'm sitting out in the car, and he comes back out with this guy. So we're riding in the car. And we're just talking. My friend and I were sitting across from each other, and he's sitting in the back seat. Doesn't look up the whole time, head down the whole time. And we're just talking about God. We're talking about faith. And so finally the guy just doesn't seem to be overly concerned about where his house is. I keep having to ask him where it is. And finally he says, oh, you just turn off here and go. And, oh yeah, this is fine over here. So my friend gets out to kind of let him out of the back seat. And I turn around to him. And he hasn't looked up the whole time. I said, may God be with you. And he sort of looks up at me and looks me straight in the eye and says, he is with me. Is he with you? And what do you say? What do you say to that? It would be one thing if I was on the street with a street corner preacher was telling me that, if I don't. But this is a guy in a Catholic church that you pick up and doesn't say anything the entire time. You haven't even looked at him, and he looks you right in the eye and tells you that. And he got out, and we drove away a little ways away, and we're like, oh my gosh, who was that? And so to this day, I can't say it was my guardian angel or it was an angel, but it was and it bothered me. It just stayed in my crop. Like, I'm fine with God. How could what I believe be wrong? I believe what I believe, and God, how could he disrespect that? So that was one of the biggest troubles that I had was getting over my sense of objective versus subjective. Like, how can something be if I believe it in my heart? So that kind of looming over my head, I transitioned in the first 2 years of college. I was at a place called UNC Greensboro, went to UNC Chapel Hill. I made the decision because I literally remember thinking in my head, this is going to be difficult, but I choose growth over mediocrity because I was going to be, staying behind and just kind of living in a house with guys and not really doing anything. So I don't care if I'm uncomfortable, but I want to grow. So I'm in Chapel Hill, and it is lonely. It's a purgatory. God took me out in the desert, his beloved out into the desert. And I was alone. I was just very alone. And I felt out of the depths. I cried to you. I couldn't take it anymore. I was like, okay, fine. I want to believe in my truth, but I don't want to believe it. I want to be happier. I mean, it was maybe selfish, but I desire happiness more than I desire to hold on to my blessed truth for all of eternity and be miserable. Sounds like Satan, right? And so I remember just one evening, I can't take it anymore. Help me, save me. And it became as clear as day. It was the simple sign Jesus saves. I finally understood what that meant. When you're in a pit, you don't want a philosophy. You want somebody to get you out of it. You don't want Buddha to tell you, transcend it. You're in hell. You want to be out. You want someone to take you. You want somebody to take you out. And so if for no other reason, I reached out, sort of the image of Peter in the water, like sinking to the Lord. And I was. It was my confirmation name for that reason. It's what I imagine it. So that's basically, I kind of pseudo made a decision. And I have to say at that point, sort of flirting with the Christian faith. But I was still flirting. Like, I wouldn't give up my will. So I was going to this non-denominational church with a very charismatic guy, but, you could see it was very novelty, look what miracles we're doing. And, it was, and I liked the idea of being saved by just saying, okay, I need you to save me. But I knew that this really wasn't going to challenge me beyond myself. But I floundered for quite a bit, and I didn't want to give myself completely. Once again, I feel a little like Joseph in the sense of dreams. I remember having this dream one night. Of course, this is the dream in some ways, the dream for me. So I'm sleeping, obviously, I'm dreaming, and I'm in this banquet hall. Now, mind you, I have no concept of Catholic theology, really sacrament. I mean, I haven't, like I said, I'm not even going to a Catholic church. So I'm in this banquet hall, and it's after a banquet. I don't know what they've eaten, and in retrospect, I probably have a pretty good idea. And I'm standing there, and to my left, just slightly to my left, is the Blessed Virgin Mary. Okay. And behind her, probably about 20 feet or something, there are these figures marching out, like they're marching out to battle, like they're marching literally, but they're in rags. So we're looking at her and looking back. So they're in rags, and so all of a sudden the line stops, and standing directly in front of me, who kind of turns and looks my way, is Jesus. And he looks at me like I'm not even there. And then he turns back and the line, it marches out. And then I look at Mary and she looks at me like, are you coming? Are you coming? She doesn't say anything. Nothing is said of this entire dream. And then I woke up. And I said, okay, I remember getting up to get some water. I said, okay, I get the point. All right. And I didn't mention this before, and it's ridiculous for me not to remember to mention it, but Mary was the only one I would really listen to because of this mystical curiosity. And she was constantly leading me back to reading about her son and knowing. And the fact, I personally don't have any trouble with the intercession of Mary for the exact reason that I just described to you. That's exactly what she did. His way was too hard for me. I didn't want to change. I didn't want what holiness required of me. And I wanted to make 1,000 excuses for why that was. But I just couldn't resist her warmth and her maternity. And this, I attribute my mother to this openness to Mary because she was a very good mother. And so I woke up from that, and a few weeks later I said, okay, I bit the bullet, and I said, and it was an act of the will. There was no romance in it. I was still the same person that didn't feel particularly inclined to go to church. But I said, Father, you have told me that is the only way to you through your son. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. I've looked at every other stone. I've tried to avoid, and this is terrible to say this because our Lord loves us so much. But yeah, I didn't want him, but he wanted me, thank God. Save me, And so ultimately, this was the beginning of a slow romance. But today I'm happier than I've ever been. I can say that I always tell people there are two love stories I like to talk about. My love story with my wife and my Lord. And over time, as I began to accept his discipline and his truth, the emotional, the affective came alive for me. But up until that point, and also to say the Eucharist and Mary are the two things that are like a sweet aroma of God that pulled me in. I remember my mom bringing me when I was having kind of a bit of a nervous breakdown or an anxiety panic attack, bringing me to the Blessed Sacrament, and I didn't know what it was, and I remember just the feeling, the presence, like I said, that radiating love, saying, I'm not going to take this away from you, but if you trust me, I will lead you home.
Would you say, Sean, then with this awakening, both through the mystical experience of Mary and then the intimacy with the Eucharist, was it Scripture? Was it the doctrines of the Church? Was it liturgical experiences that kind of finalized it for you to bring you into the fold?
I would say what finalized it with me, it's in some ways it's embarrassingly unscriptural, but it is scriptural. It can't be unscriptural. It is the idea, the notion that Jesus Christ is God and has authority, that I had to listen to him. I needed that to believe that definitively. I also needed to accept the idea of a church that didn't bow to me, that the truth was the truth, and that was actually in the end what was attractive to me. Like, wow, you won't just change your opinion. So this affirmed in the beginning that personal nature of God. God is God. My wife is my wife. Sometimes she doesn't agree with me just because I want her to agree with me. She's her own person. Just as God has a right to be who God is. And that's what's beautiful. That's what's adventurous. Not that you make something turn into yourself. That's what hell is.
Well, Sean, I feel like we just scratched the surface on your journey. So thank you so much. I'm going to tell the audience it's called Woodsy Do gkcrocks.blogspot.com is the full title of Sean's blog, though I think if you go to Man in the Woods and search, you'll find it. The reason I mention that, if you want to find out more about the details of Sean's journey or about his writings, you can go to there to find out more. Thanks a lot, Sean.
Thank you so much, Fred.
I couldn't think of, all the way through, I was thinking of Augustine's statement about our heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee, and that was your search.
Too.
That was your search. That was your search, finding the rest in Jesus Christ. So glad you're home, my friend.
It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home, and I pray that Sean's journey is an encouragement to you. God bless. See you next week.